Hollywood in the 1960s was a kingdom of bright lights and fragile egos. On stage 12 of a major studio lot, dozens of crew members moved like clockwork, adjusting lights, rolling cables, rehearsing cues. At the center of it all stood one of the most luminous stars of her generation, Elizabeth Taylor. She wore a deep emerald gown that shimmered beneath the hot studio lamps. Her violet eyes, so often described in magazines as impossibly beautiful, were focused, not glamorous. She was working. She was always working. Despite the diamonds, despite the headlines, she took her craft seriously. Across the set stood another legend, relaxed yet observant, Dean Martin. To many, he was the effortless crooner, the man who made fame look like an afterthought. But those who paid close attention knew something else. Dean watched everything. He noticed everything. The scene they were filming that afternoon was simple on paper, a dramatic confrontation between Taylor's character and a supporting role. It required emotional restraint, subtlety, timing. The director called action. Elizabeth delivered her lines softly, measured. Sometimes strength isn't loud, she said in character, her voice steady. Sometimes it's the quiet choice to endure. Cut. The word cracked through the air like a snapped wire. The producer, known around the lot for his temper and relentless pursuit of perfection, stormed from behind the monitor. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the floor. The crew instinctively stiffened. "That's not it," he barked. "Where's the fire? Where's the passion? We're burning money every minute." A silence fell over the set. Elizabeth blinked once. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply nodded. "Let's try again." But the producer wasn't finished. "You're giving me nothing," he shouted, his voice echoing against the soundstage walls. "We can't afford another weak take." The words hung in the air like smoke. Technicians lowered their eyes. The boom operator adjusted his grip. Even the assistant director shifted uncomfortably. No one dared speak. Elizabeth stood still, her posture dignified. Though the sting of public humiliation was unmistakable, fame does not shield anyone from disrespect. In fact, sometimes it magnifies it. From across the set, Dean Martin set down his coffee cup. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply walked forward. Each step was deliberate, calm, controlled. The producer continued muttering about schedules and budgets. Unaware that the atmosphere had shifted, Dean stopped a few feet away. "You done?" he asked quietly. The producer turned. "Excuse me." Dean's expression was relaxed, but his eyes were serious. "You're upset, we get it, but screaming at her won't make the scene better." A murmur rippled through the crew, quickly swallowed by silence. The producer scoffed. "I'm running a production here, and she's carrying it," Dean replied evenly. "No shouting, no theatrics, just truth." Elizabeth looked at him, surprised, not because someone defended her, but because he did it without ego, without spectacle. Dean continued, his tone steady. "You want fire? Maybe give her space to light the match." The producer opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time all afternoon, he seemed unsure. Dean gestured gently toward the set. "Let's reset. Give her the respect she's earned. You'll get your scene." There was something powerful about the way he said it. Not confrontational, not submissive, just firm. The producer inhaled, exhaled, and stepped back. "Fine, places." Everyone, the crew, moved quickly, grateful for the de-escalation. Elizabeth took her mark again. This time, something subtle had shifted, not in her talent, but in the room. The tension had transformed into focus, action. Her next performance was electric. Not loud but layered. Controlled fury simmered beneath quiet composure. When she delivered the final line, there wasn't a single unnecessary movement. "Sometimes strength," she said, her voice steady as steel, "is refusing to break when someone wants you to." Cut. Silence. Then the director whispered, "That's the one." No one cheered. No applause, just a collective understanding that something important had happened. The producer nodded stiffly. "Good. Moving on." But the crew knew the truth. It wasn't pressure that created that performance. It was dignity. As lights were adjusted for the next setup, Elizabeth approached Dean. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. He shrugged. "Yeah, I did." She smiled faintly. Why? Dean picked up his coffee again. Because nobody does their best work while being torn down. She held his gaze for a moment. Thank you. He gave her that familiar half-smile. Liz, you don't need saving. But everybody deserves respect. Across the stage, whispers spread. Not gossip, admiration. And an industry known for grand gestures and louder scandals. The most powerful moment that day wasn't captured on film. It was a simple act of courage. Dean didn't shout back. He didn't humiliate the producer. He didn't create a bigger scene. He modeled calm strength. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching, camera operators, costume assistants, interns fetching coffee, that kindness can carry more authority than anger ever could. As the day went on, the set felt different, lighter, more collaborative. The producer spoke more measuredly. The crew worked with renewed energy. Elizabeth's scenes unfolded with remarkable depth. Sometimes leadership isn't about titles. It's about timing. It's about stepping forward when silence becomes complicity. That afternoon, under blazing studio lights, a lesson lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. True strength doesn't scream. It stands steady. And on that day, Dean Martin stood steady. The tension from that afternoon did not disappear when the cameras stopped rolling. It lingered quietly in the hallways, in the dressing rooms, in the careful tone people used when speaking to one another. A film set has its own heartbeat. And when something disrupts it, everyone feels the echo. Elizabeth Taylor sat alone in her dressing room, the emerald gown carefully draped over a chair. The mirror lights framed her reflection, but without the character, without the dialogue. She looked less like a screen legend and more like a woman carrying invisible weight. Fame had never shielded her from criticism. If anything, it magnified it. Every gesture analyzed, every pose interpreted, every emotion expected to be larger than life. Yet what the audience rarely understood was how much discipline it took to make intensity look effortless. There was a soft knock at the door. "Come in," she said. Dean Martin stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. He did not bring jokes with him this time. No playful charm, just quiet presence. "You all right?" he asked. She studied him for a moment before answering. "I've been yelled at before," she said evenly. "It's not new. That wasn't what I asked," Dean replied. A faint smile touched her face. "I'm fine." He leaned against the makeup counter. "You don't have to be fine every minute of the day." Elizabeth exhaled slowly. "Do you know what they expect from me? Not just a performance, a spectacle. If I cry, it has to be unforgettable. If I'm angry, it has to shake the walls. And if I choose subtlety, suddenly it's not enough." Dean nodded. He understood more than people realized. The public saw him as relaxed, carefree, almost detached. But maintaining that image required its own kind of armor. "Subtlety scares people," he said. "It forces them to lean in. Not everyone likes leaning in." She looked at him through the mirror. "He thinks pressure will get better results." Dean shook his head slightly. "Pressure might get noise. Respect gets truth." The words settled in the room. On the other side of the soundstage, the producer was pacing. Budget reports lay scattered across a folding table. Investors were demanding efficiency. Schedules were tight. Every delay felt like failure. In his mind, urgency justified intensity. But leadership built on fear leaves fractures. The crew had felt it. The director had felt it. And earlier that day, Elizabeth had absorbed it. What Dean had done was not rebellion. It was recalibration. The next morning, the atmosphere on set was noticeably different. The crew arrived early. Conversations were quieter but steadier. The producer greeted people with short nods rather than sharp commands. Whether it was pride or reflection, something had shifted. Elizabeth stepped onto the stage in a different costume. Her posture composed. Dean was already there, script in hand. The scene required emotional vulnerability. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just two characters confronting disappointment. Before the cameras rolled, the producer approached. "Let's take it from the top," he said. His tone measured. "We'll find the rhythm." It was not an apology, but it was an adjustment. "Action." Elizabeth delivered her lines with restrained pain. Dean responded with quiet regret. The exchange felt natural, almost unscripted. When the moment ended, no one spoke for several seconds. Cut. The director said softly, "That's powerful." The producer watched the playback monitor. He did not shout. He did not criticize. After a long pause, he nodded. "That works," he said. It was a small sentence, but it carried acknowledgement. During lunch break, a young production assistant approached Elizabeth hesitantly. "Miss Taylor," she began, "I just wanted to say, the way you handled yesterday, it meant something." Elizabeth tilted her head. "How so?" The assistant swallowed. "Sometimes people think yelling is strength, but you didn't react. You stayed steady. That helped the rest of us stay steady too." Elizabeth smiled gently. "Strength isn't always loud," she replied. Across the room, Dean overheard the exchange. He didn't interrupt. He simply sipped his coffee, satisfied that the lesson had traveled further than he expected. Later that afternoon, the producer requested a brief meeting with the principal cast. The crew pretended not to listen. "I push hard," he began, "because I want this film to matter. But maybe yesterday I pushed in the wrong direction." There was no dramatic confession, no long apology, just a recognition. Dean met his gaze. "We all want it to matter," he said. "We just get there better when we trust each other." The producer gave a short nod. "Understood." Work resumed. But something fundamental had changed. The set no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like collaboration. Elizabeth's performances deepened. Dean's presence anchored scenes with quiet gravity. The crew moved with renewed confidence. Even mistakes were corrected with discussion rather than outbursts. In the evenings, as the studio lights dimmed and the echo of footsteps faded down empty corridors, a quiet realization lingered. Leadership is not about volume. Respect is not weakness. And courage does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it walks calmly across a soundstage, sets down a coffee cup, and reminds everyone in the room that dignity is not negotiable. The film would eventually be remembered for its performances. Critics would praise the chemistry. Audiences would see only the polished final cut. But those who stood beneath the hot lights during those long days knew the deeper story. They knew that one moment of calm conviction had reshaped the rhythm of an entire production. And they knew that true influence is not measured by how loudly you speak, but by how firmly you stand when it matters most. By the third week of filming, the change on set was undeniable. What had once felt tense and unpredictable now carried a steady rhythm. Crew members spoke with more confidence. The director took creative risks. Even the producer, once quick to react, had grown more measured in his tone. The transformation was not dramatic or public. It was subtle, almost invisible to an outsider. But to those who worked there every day, it felt like breathing easier. Elizabeth Taylor arrived early one morning before most of the crew. The stage lights were still dim, casting long shadows across unfinished set pieces. She walked slowly across the floor, script in hand, rehearsing her lines in a near whisper. This next sequence would be the emotional centerpiece of the film. Her character was meant to confront betrayal not with rage, but with clarity. It required restraint, the kind that reveals strength without spectacle. Dean Martin entered quietly, noticing her alone at center stage. "You rehearse when no one's watching," he observed. She glanced at him with a soft smile. "That's when the work is honest." Dean nodded. "You're carrying this film." She shook her head. "We all are." He paused, then said something more personal than usual. "You know, people think I don't take any of this seriously. That it all just rolls off me." "And does it?" she asked. "Not always," he admitted. "But I learned something a long time ago. If you let every loud voice decide your worth, you'll spend your life chasing approval." Elizabeth absorbed that. In Hollywood, approval was currency. Headlines could elevate or destroy. Applause could fade overnight. "I used to think proving myself meant being bigger," she said quietly. "Bigger emotion, bigger presence, bigger everything. But now I'm starting to understand that sometimes the bravest choice is to hold back." Dean gave a small, approving nod. "That's where truth lives." Later that afternoon, the pivotal scene began filming. The set was silent. Even the smallest movements felt amplified. The director called for action. Elizabeth stepped forward into the scene, her voice calm but firm. "I trusted you," she said to her co-star, her eyes steady. "Not because I was weak, but because I believed in something better." There was no shouting. No dramatic gestures. Just quiet devastation balanced with dignity. The camera lingered on her face. A single tear formed but did not fall. It remained suspended, as if even sorrow refused to collapse her composure. When the scene ended, no one moved. "Cut," the director whispered. The producer stood behind the monitor, watching the playback. His expression was unreadable. The crew waited. After a long moment, he spoke. "That's it," he said. "That's exactly it." It was more than approval. It was recognition. For the first time since production began, he approached Elizabeth without urgency in his steps. "That was powerful," he told her. "Thank you." She met his eyes calmly. "We found it together." Across the set, Dean observed the exchange. He did not interrupt. He did not need to. The shift was complete. That evening, as the crew packed equipment and the stage slowly emptied, the producer lingered behind. He approached Dean near the exit. "You were right," he said quietly. Dean raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "Respect," the producer answered. "I thought pressure would sharpen everyone. But it was dulling the edge." Dean gave a small smile. "We all learn." The producer extended his hand. Dean shook it firmly. In that simple gesture, there was mutual understanding. Not defeat. Not victory. Growth. Over the following days, the production moved smoothly. Challenges still rose: missed cues, technical delays, rewritten dialogue, but they were handled with conversation rather than confrontation. Something else changed as well. Younger crew members began speaking up with ideas. The director experimented with softer lighting and emotional scenes. Actors requested extra rehearsal time. Without fear of ridicule, the environment had shifted from survival to collaboration. On the final day of filming that sequence, Elizabeth stood once more beneath the bright lights. She looked around at the faces of the crew: gaffers, assistants, camera operators, people who often remained invisible beyond the credits. "Thank you," she said simply. It was not a grand speech. It was sincere. Dean stood beside her. "Good work, everyone," he added. As applause echoed lightly through the soundstage, it was not for fame or reputation. It was for shared effort. The lesson of those weeks would not appear in interviews. It would not be printed in magazines. But it stayed with everyone who witnessed it. Strength does not demand attention. Leadership does not require volume. And dignity, once defended, has a way of multiplying. Under the glow of studio lights, a film was made. But more importantly, something deeper was restored: a reminder that even in an industry built on illusion, integrity remains real. The final week of production arrived almost quietly. There were no dramatic announcements, no grand countdowns. Just a growing awareness that the long days, the carefully rehearsed lines, and the steady rhythm they had built together were coming to an end. On the last morning of principal photography, the studio felt different. Not tense. Not pressured. Reflective. Elizabeth Taylor stood near the edge of the set, watching crew members adjust the final lighting arrangement. The emerald gown from weeks earlier hung nearby on a rack, a reminder of how far the atmosphere had shifted since that difficult afternoon. Dean Martin joined her, hands in his pockets. "Feels strange wrapping up," he said. "It does," she replied. "You spend weeks building something together. Then suddenly, it belongs to the audience." Dean nodded. "That's the business, but the experience," she added softly, "that belongs to us." The final scene to be filmed was simple. No confrontation. No heavy dialogue. Just two characters sharing a moment of understanding after conflict had passed. It mirrored, in many ways, what had happened behind the scenes. The director called for quiet on set. The familiar words followed. Action. Elizabeth delivered her final lines with warmth rather than intensity. "We can't change how it started," she said in character, "but we can choose how it ends." Dean responded with gentle sincerity. "Then let's end it better than we began." The line hung in the air with unexpected weight. "Cut," the director called. Silence lingered for a breath. Then applause broke out across the stage. Not loud or chaotic, but steady and heartfelt. Crew members clapped for the actors. The actors clapped for the crew. Even the producer joined in, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. He stepped forward. "I've produced many films," he began, his voice measured. "But this one taught me something I didn't expect to learn." The crew grew still. "I thought control meant raising my voice. I thought urgency meant pressure. I was wrong." He paused briefly. What made this production stronger was trust. There was no defensiveness in his tone. Only honesty. Elizabeth inclined her head respectfully. Dean gave a small nod, acknowledging the courage it takes to admit growth. After the applause faded, people began dismantling the set. Walls that had held emotional scenes were carefully unscrewed. Lights that once blazed with intensity were lowered and packed away. The illusion of the film slowly dissolved back into lumber and cables. Elizabeth walked across the now half-empty stage one last time. Without the backdrop and props, it looked smaller. Almost ordinary. Dean approached her. "Funny how big it feels when you're in the middle of it," he said. "And how small it looks once it's over," she replied. "That's life," he answered. "Moments feel enormous while they're happening. Later, they're just stories." She looked at him thoughtfully. "Some stories change people." He smiled slightly. "Those are the ones that matter." Across the studio, a young assistant who had witnessed the earlier confrontation stood watching them. She had seen tension transform into teamwork. She had seen anger give way to respect. The lesson would stay with her long after this film faded from theaters. As the afternoon light filtered through the high studio windows, the producer approached Elizabeth once more. "I owe you something," he said quietly. She raised an eyebrow. "You don't owe me anything. I owe you acknowledgement," he corrected. "You stayed composed when I didn't." "That set the tone for everyone," she answered calmly. "We all have moments we're not proud of. What matters is what we do after." He nodded slowly. "I won't forget that." Neither would he forget Dean's steady intervention weeks earlier, not because it embarrassed him, but because it revealed a better way to lead. By evening, the stage was nearly empty. Equipment trucks waited outside. Contracts were complete. Schedules fulfilled. Dean picked up his coat. "Ready for the next adventure?" he asked. Elizabeth smiled, a mixture of fatigue and fulfillment in her expression. "Always." They walked toward the exit together, footsteps echoing across the bare floor. Before stepping outside, Dean paused and looked back at the darkened soundstage. "You know," he said quietly, "people think the spotlight is the most powerful thing in this business." Elizabeth followed his gaze. "Isn't it?" He shook his head. "No. It's what you do when the spotlight isn't kind." She understood. The door closed behind them, leaving the stage in silence. The film would go on to receive praise. Critics would highlight performances. Audiences would debate favorite scenes. But none of them would see the true turning point of the day. Respect replaced fear, and dignity redirected the course of an entire production. When the lights fade and the applause ends, what remains is not fame. It is character. And on that set, character proved stronger than volume, stronger than pressure, stronger than pride.